Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Sudaso, and this evening we have our weekly monk chat session, an opportunity to ask questions about Buddhism, and there might be some replies. So you can type in questions at any time and I'll reply to them as they appear. So we'll start with paying homage to the Buddha and then I'll start going through the questions. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So hello to the people checking in online. So hello to Maria, Rick, Alyssa, another Maria, Wise Man Say So, Karuna, Yankee, Bhumika, and Random, and Julie. Welcome to all of you. And I see one question so far. So Wise Man Say So says, can you please briefly explain the difference between perception, mental formation, and consciousness? I have trouble distinguishing the difference. Okay. So I assume you're asking about the third, fourth, and fifth of the 5 khandhas. So khandha is the components of body and mind. So the 5 components. You'll commonly see the word khandha translated as aggregate, which I always found a very puzzling translation. You'll also see it translated in other ways. I've seen heap, which I find highly amusing and also pretty useless. What are some other translations of khandha? Aggregate's been in pretty heavy use for decades now. But yeah, it means component. So the 5 khandhas is the 5 components, the 5 components of body and mind. The third, fourth, and fifth are sanya, sankhara, and vijnana. So sanya, it is commonly translated as perception, but the way it's used in the suttas is more like recognition or identification. So sanya is that aspect of mind which identifies things, which recognizes things, which puts labels on things. So when we have some kind of sensory experience, at the very beginning, it's just raw data, like raw sensory data. Sanya is the mind taking that raw data and figuring out what it is. So for example, you look at something and initially it's just a bunch of random visual information. And then the mind compiles that information and says, okay, this fits more or less what I would normally call a person. So a human being sitting cross-legged on a meditation cushion. So sanya is that process of identifying, recognizing and labeling an experience. And this doesn't necessarily happen as an active verbal mental process, like thinking like, oh, what is that? Oh, I think that's a person sitting on a cushion. It tends to happen very quickly. So it has an almost automatic feel to it. So we have a sensation and we just immediately recognize it or identify it. The problem is that sanya is often inaccurate. So often what we're actually doing is we are rewriting our sensory experience to match what we expect it to be or what we believe it to be. So our actual experience is usually a bit distorted by the sanya process, the process of recognition or identification. And this then is why the word sanya is often translated as perception, because it's actually often misperception. It's how we misperceive our experience. The next one is sankhara, and mental formation is a common translation of sankhara. Mental activity or mental process those are also okay. In some contexts, mental object is correct. A more general word which encompasses all of this would be mental phenomena, which encompasses both objects and activities, and as well as processes and so on. This includes things like thoughts, memories, emotions. So whereas, again, sanya is this usually a very quick, almost automatic reaction of identifying. Sankhara is a bit more complex. It's the activities and objects and mental processes which we engage in beyond that. So maybe, again, you have a sensory experience. It's pleasant, painful, or neutral. So that's Vedana, the second of the 5 khandhas. You identify it. You're like, okay, I think that's an image of a person sitting. And then sankhara is when you start thinking. It's like, oh, now I remember that person's name is such and such. I've known them for so many years. And you start thinking like, well, yesterday their behavior was not the greatest, but tomorrow we're planning to do this and that. So then that's sankhara. Sankhara is when you're remembering and thinking and engaging in some kind of mental process or activity. It would also include things like imagination, or visualization. That also would fit under sankhara. Vijnana, on the other hand, so the 5th of the 5 khandhas, vijnana, is commonly translated as consciousness. I've also seen it translated awareness, but we have to be a little bit careful with that kind of word. So consciousness is usually, in most places in the suttas, defined as awareness of a sensory domain. For example, chakku vijnana literally means eye consciousness, but it means awareness of the visual field, awareness of seeing. And usually that's also connected with self-identity. Though, of course, in a fully awakened being, the self-identity component is not present. But for unawakened beings, normally sensory consciousness has self-identity wrapped in. So I am seeing that visual field. I am the one who is seeing those visual objects. So that's vijnana. So that's a relatively brief summary of the last 3 of the 5 khandhas. And Julie says, do we suffer because of craving or because of delusion? Both. Julie continues, I understand that there is craving because of delusion. That is correct. Yeah, all craving is based on delusion. Specifically, the delusion that we will become happy if we get what we're craving. So ultimately what we want is we want to be happy. And we think, delusional, we think that if we get the specific objects of desire, then that will bring happiness. So you think, I want to eat chocolate. Why? It's not actually that you want chocolate necessarily, but rather it's that you want to be happy, and you think that getting chocolate will make you happy. So the delusion then creates craving, and the craving is uncomfortable. So delusion is also uncomfortable, but it's a more subtle form of discomfort. It's the discomfort of confusion or uncertainty. It's the discomfort of being out of harmony with reality. So that's a bit more subtle and refined form of discomfort that's a bit harder to identify. But the discomfort of craving is very obvious. It's very clear. Like that feeling when you really want something, it's actually quite unpleasant. It's quite uncomfortable. So that's dukkha. So this is why when the Buddha speaks about the Four Noble Truths, his focus is on craving. Because craving is where we experience dukkha the most strongly. However, craving is inevitably arising from delusion. It's based in delusion. Without delusion, there would be no craving. And as for your question, where should our focus be? Well, I mean, realistically, whether you focus on reducing craving or reducing delusion, then the end result will be the same. So usually it's more about what is going to be useful and beneficial and productive now. And sometimes you'll find you get better results by focusing specifically on craving, other times focusing on delusion. But actually, if you're focusing on reducing craving, then that will also reduce your delusion. And if you're focused on reducing delusion, that will also reduce your craving. So craving and delusion are intimately connected. They're bound together. So then also, whichever one you target, it will affect the other one as well. So you can't go wrong depending on which one you pick. It's really up to you. But we do tend to put, it really depends. Like you can focus on either one. It really doesn't matter. I could say that focusing on delusion is more important, because if you undercut delusion, then the whole massive suffering will fall away. But often, in order to get at delusion, we first need to clear away the surface defilements of the mind. So working on the more obvious problems of craving can then make it easier to identify the more subtle underlying problems. And Jefferson says, in other live, I had a question: if a monk can show supernatural powers to lay people, the name of the sutta, Mahaka Sutta. Yes, I did look at the sutta. So there is a Vinaya rule that monks are not supposed to report their powers to lay people. And yeah, generally speaking, we're not supposed to show off powers if it's in order to get profit. So we're not supposed to, if a monk has some kind of psychic powers, they're not supposed to show it off to lay people in order to get something from them. Kind of like, oh, I'll levitate if you give me a cookie. Like that's not allowed. But also in the Vinaya, there's a section where the Buddha makes it quite clear that, I forget exactly how he phrases it, but basically he says that psychic powers are in the domain of those who have psychic powers. In other words, the standard Vinaya rules don't really apply when dealing with psychic powers. So there does seem to be slightly mixed messages in the suttas around the topic, in the Vinaya, around the topic of psychic powers. And in the suttas themselves, we actually don't find anything about displaying or not displaying. It's only in the Vinaya that we find these distinctions being made. So clearly the Buddha didn't seem to think it was that big of a deal. But I think, again, it comes down to motivation. That's what we see in the Vinaya anyways. It's about motivation. So why are you doing what you're doing? Because the Buddha would also sometimes display psychic powers, but it was when he saw that it would be helpful for increasing people's faith, or for teaching them Dhamma in a way that they could understand more effectively. So the Buddha also saw that there actually were circumstances when the display of psychic powers was useful, it was beneficial. But it's also notable that most of the time the Buddha didn't. One of the things I find interesting about the Buddha is that, again, it's stated clearly in many, many suttas that the Buddha could levitate, he could fly, he could teleport. And usually he didn't. Usually he walked on foot for hundreds of kilometers. So although the Buddha could do these things, he usually did not. He usually chose to act like a normal person. So I find that very interesting. And we can speculate as to exactly why. But I do find it interesting that although the Buddha could do all kinds of crazy stuff, he could walk through walls, he could read minds, he could teleport, mostly he instead acted like a normal person. A normal person with infinite wisdom and compassion and no trace of greed or hatred in his mind. But still, he walked, he talked, he ate food, he wore clothes, he did normal things. So that I do find interesting. He usually did not, although he had all these powers, he mostly didn't use them. And this is also because psychic powers don't really have anything to do with awakening. Awakening is a process of wisdom. And some awakened people have psychic powers and some don't. So it's not necessary. It's kind of a side grade. It's not required. It's something which might happen and might not, and it's not really that important. Okay, and then Sergio asks, Bante, you once said that your practice was 99% samadhi. May I ask why is this? I think I did say that once. Yeah. Because when the mind has very strong samadhi, then even doing vipassana just 1% of the time gets very strong results. That's why. Most people that I've spoken to who try to do a predominantly vipassana practice usually have very shallow and very weak meditation. They're not getting much results. So my experience has always been that when the mind is in very strong samadhi, so very stable, very still, very sharp, very clear, then it's extremely easy to cultivate vipassana and to get strong results from vipassana very quickly. Whereas when the mind is not in deep samadhi, then vipassana mostly feels like a waste of time. However, that's my experience, and other people report other experiences. So other people do seem to get benefit from doing vipassana when they don't have good samadhi, and that's okay. And some people find that doing a bit of vipassana helps to prepare the mind for then cultivating strong samadhi. That's also fine. Some people just find samadhi practice really boring at first, and they find vipassana practice more interesting. So they practice vipassana because that helps to build up their enthusiasm. That's also okay. So that's all fine. But in my own practice, I really like samadhi practice. It's very soothing and very pleasant. It's very peaceful. And because, again, when the mind is very stable and very clear, then vipassana practice produces powerful results very quickly. So yeah, maybe it's true. I mean, these numbers sound a bit arbitrary, 99% samadhi, 1% vipassana. It sounds a bit random. But if that is actually true, then that 1% it counts for a lot. It's very powerful. Okay. And Wise Man Say So asks, did the Buddha ever have any children? If so, what was his relationship like with his children? Does he talk about parenting in any of the suttas? So according to the suttas, yes, the Buddha had at least one child that we know of. His name was Rahula. And after the Buddha was fully enlightened, then he went back and taught the Dhamma to his son, as well as to his former wife, as well as to much of his family. And both his son and his former wife became arhats, fully enlightened beings. Much of his family became Buddhists. Many of them became monks. So what was his relationship like with his children? Well, I mean, he left his child as soon as the child was born. So initially, relationship was a bit non-existent. He didn't see his son for the first several years. But then after that, his relationship was great. I mean, he taught his son how to attain full awakening. That's just about the best parenting I can imagine. So actually, I think some people say the Buddha's a deadbeat dad, but actually I think he's the ideal perfect dad because he taught his child how to attain full enlightenment, which is way better than most parents do. So I think the Buddha did great. Does he talk about parenting in any of the suttas? There are a few. There's a few suttas where the Buddha talks about the responsibilities of parents toward children and the importance of being supportive to your children and teaching them morality and so on. There are a few, yeah. And Mir asks, would you mind explaining mundane right view and supramundane right view? You're probably referring to the Sammaditthi Sutta, which is from the Majjhima Nikaya. It's one of the suttas attributed to Venerable Sariputta, which I think may be the only place in the suttas where the distinction between mundane right view and supramundane right view is made. It might appear in one or two other places, but that's the main sutta where this distinction is made. And it actually explains right in that sutta what the difference is. So mundane right view is a basic understanding of good karma. So it's understanding, when I'm generous, then that leads to happiness and prosperity. When I'm kind and friendly, that leads to happiness and prosperity. When I avoid intoxicants, then that leads to wisdom and clarity of mind, and so on. So a basic understanding of good karma, which then inspires somebody to live a moral, principled life based upon kindness and generosity, which then leads to them having a more pleasant rebirth. So ordinary good karma leading to ordinary good luck. So that's mundane right view. Supramundane or transcendent right view is understanding how we generate suffering. So understanding the Four Noble Truths, understanding how we generate dukkha, understanding that our dukkha is arising from desire and delusion, recognizing that delusion is ultimately the cause of all of our problems, and recognizing that everything, therefore, is ultimately impermanent and impersonal. So that then the mind starts letting go. It starts letting go of attachment and identification with anything, with any aspect of body, mind, or the experience arising from body and mind. So this is transcendent right view, which leads to full awakening, because it leads to completely dropping attachment and identification with body and mind. And therefore, it leads to escaping from the cycle of rebirth, the cycle of dukkha. So that's the difference between mundane right view and supramundane right view. Of course, supramundane right view or transcendent right view is built upon mundane right view, because you need to already have an understanding of how good karma works and how rebirth works and so on, in order to understand the Four Noble Truths and the escape from the cycle of suffering. And Julie asks, can lay people accompany monks on alms round in Thailand? Yeah, I've seen it happen. Yeah, it does happen. Usually the way that works is that lay people will follow behind the monks and then help the monks. If people give the monks more than they can carry, then the lay people will help the monks carry the extra things. That's what you normally see. Lay people don't normally do alms round in the sense of collecting food donations. That would be a bit strange. But like going along with the monks in order to help out, that's pretty common. These days, they'll also accompany monks to take photos, but that's the age that we live in. Jefferson says, if a layperson becomes an arhat and doesn't become a monk, he dies. Well, it doesn't actually explicitly say that anywhere in the suttas, but this has been a common belief in Buddhism for hundreds of years, possibly thousands of years. So it doesn't specifically say in the suttas that if a layperson becomes an arhat and doesn't become a monk, they will die. It doesn't specifically say that anywhere. What we do see in the suttas is that lay people becoming arhats is extremely rare. There's only 2 or 3 cases I can think of, a couple of bhikkhus and 1 bhikkhuni. So people who became arhats and then immediately tried to become monks. And in some cases, they did actually become monks. There's a couple cases where the person did not become a monk and they did die. In the process of, like in one case, in the process of trying to find a robes and bowls so that they could become ordained. In the process of looking for robes and bowl, they died. But I don't necessarily think that you're guaranteed to die if you don't become a monk. It's more just a fully enlightened being naturally will become a monk because their mind is fully in the mode of renunciation. And monastic life is renunciation. That's what it is. And the mind of an awakened being is renunciation. That's what it is. So it's just natural that an awakened being will be a monk. So they, again, on the extremely few cases that we have recorded of lay people becoming arhats, they immediately tried to become monks because that's what their mind is naturally inclining towards. And Randall asks, what is the Buddhist view on sexual attraction, specifically homosexuality? Well, in the early suttas, we actually don't see any distinction made between heterosexuality and homosexuality. There's just no distinction made. Apparently, it wasn't important, wasn't an issue. So the Buddha was clearly aware of homosexuality because it is mentioned in a handful of places in the early suttas, but the Buddha never made any distinction between homosexuality and heterosexuality. So he never said that one is better or worse than the other, or that one is more proper or less proper. He never said anything like that anywhere. Sexual attraction in general, whether it's for someone of the same sex or opposite sex or both or neither, sexual attraction in general is a product of delusion. It's a product of an untrained mind, of an unawakened mind. So it's a symptom of not being fully enlightened. And it's also quite normal and natural that people experience sexual impulses. However, it's also something which contributes to suffering. It contributes to dukkha. So it's a manifestation of desire, of craving, of delusion. So for somebody who is really committed to attaining awakening as quickly as possible, then celibacy is encouraged. And all Buddhist monks, in theory, all Buddhist monks are celibate for this reason. It's because it helps us to train the mind to let go of desire and attachment so that the mind can reach full awakening. Again, it doesn't matter whether somebody is attracted to people of the same sex or opposite sex or both or neither. It doesn't matter. What matters is that sexual desire itself is an obstacle to awakening, regardless of what it's for. For lay people who are not interested in celibacy, then the Buddha instead taught the precept to avoid sexual misconduct. And sexual misconduct is defined as things like adultery. So if you know somebody else is married or in a committed relationship, then don't do things with them. Or if you yourself are in a relationship, then don't cheat on your partner. If somebody is too young to understand what's going on, then you don't do something with them. So things like child molestation is considered sexual misconduct. So things like that. So things like infidelity and sexual assault and so on. Those are sexual misconduct. But again, it has nothing to do with the relative gender or sex of the people involved. So homosexuality in the early Buddhist text doesn't seem to be a problem at all. That said, you will sometimes encounter a certain amount of discrimination against homosexuality in Buddhist communities, but that's just because you'll find discrimination against homosexuality everywhere in the world. It's nothing to do with anything the Buddha ever taught. And Wise Man Say So asks, after we die, do we ever cross paths with some of our loved ones in the next life? Absolutely, not necessarily in the immediate next life, but inevitably. Actually, there's a lovely discourse in the Singha Nikaya where the Buddha says that everyone we meet has at some point been our mother, our father, our sister, our brother, our daughter, our son, our friend, our pet cat, like our worst enemy, our best friend, like everything. Everyone we meet at some point or another, we've been related to them. So it's literally impossible to meet somebody who hasn't at some point been one of your loved ones. So even your worst enemy in this life, that used to be your best friend. Could have been your beloved mother, beloved sister. same in the future. The people you know in this life, you'll just keep meeting them again and again and again. But you may not recognize them next time around. You may not remember them, but you will keep meeting them over and over again. Yeah, this is part of why there's the experience of, for example, love at first sight. Often it's because you meet someone who you already have a strong connection with from a past life. So there's an immediate sense of mutual affection, which may not be possible to explain, but it's because you are already good friends from past lives, and that you can still feel that when you meet them. Or the opposite, hate at first sight. You meet someone and you just instantly hate each other, like instant enemies. And it's like, well, where did that come from? I don't even know this person. It's like, well, not in this life, but clearly you were in pretty bad terms in a past life, and you haven't quite forgotten. So yeah, it happens. We just keep running across each other's paths over and over again. And Kruna says, but only because they were attacked by a cow, not because of their attainment. You're referring to the layperson attaining arhatship thing. Yeah, it's actually not clearly stated in the suttas. Like, oh, this person was attacked by a cow because they were a lay arhat. Like, it doesn't actually say that. It just says, while looking for robes and bowl so that they could become a monk, while looking for robes and bowl, they were killed by a stray cow. That's all we have. It doesn't say specifically because they were a layperson. Like, this is just an extrapolation that people came up with hundreds of years later. Sorry. But yeah, it has led to kind of a common trope in Buddhist circles, like, if you do become a lay arhat, stay away from cows. Actually, a better thing is just become a monk right away. Then you don't need to worry about avoiding cows. Jefferson asks, what is nibana dhatu, the element of nibana? Oh boy. I have spoken about this many times, and there is no easy, short answer. But here we go. Can I give a short, easy answer? Briefly speaking, it's the asankata dhatu, the unconditioned element, that aspect of reality which cannot be defined in terms of objects or things or characteristics. That is the nibana dhatu, which is also called the asankata dhatu, that which is not constructed. Asankata literally means unconstructed. And also it's related to the word sankhara, so not a sankhara. So sankhara meaning here a discrete object, a separate thing. So the nibana dhatu is that aspect of reality which is not constructed, not composed of things, which has no definable attributes or characteristics. It cannot be separated or pieced apart. It has no beginning and no end. That's the nibana dhatu. A great book on this, it's actually quite old at this point. It's about 20 years old or so. It's called The Island. It's a collection of suttas specifically about nibbana and about the nibana dhatu and asankata dhatu. Another really, really good collection, and I don't think it's ever been translated fully into English, but it's called Nibbana, the Mind Stilled, by Bhante Katakurunde Nyanananda, senior Sri Lankan monk who passed away a few years ago. He gave a series of quite thorough talks about Nibbana Dhatu. But last I checked, only about 2/3 of them had been translated into English. But those are still really, really delightful, amazing explanations. Both of these books are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages long, which is why my little 10-second answer is not sufficient. And Demsing says, what kind of meditation cushion do you find most supportive for samadhi meditation, kapok, buckwheat, etc.? And how high? How important is it to stay still while sitting? So of course it's different for different people because different people have different bodies. I usually prefer relatively thin, soft kapok meditation cushions. But it hasn't always been that way. There were times in the past where I preferred thicker cushions. But usually I've always found kapok better. I've always found that buckwheat cushions put my legs to sleep. No matter how I sit, it always puts my legs to sleep. Whereas softer kapok cushions will not put my legs to sleep as long as I position my body correctly. How important is it to stay still while sitting? Well, it depends on whether or not you want good samadhi. If you want good samadhi, then don't move. It makes a huge difference. Try it sometime. Try sitting for an hour or 2 or 3 or 4 without moving. And you'll see what I'm talking about. It makes a huge difference. Every time you move, you break your samadhi. Every time you move your body, you move your mind. And moving the mind is the opposite of samadhi. Okay, and Julie asks, can Theravada bhikkhunis be fully ordained like bhikkhus? Yes, absolutely. Yep, in fact, there are lots of bhikkhunis these days, fortunately. There's several hundred Theravada bhikkhunis in Thailand, several thousand in Sri Lanka, a few hundred in the different Western countries. So there's not a huge amount, but there are a fair number of Theravada bhikkhunis these days. She says, how about Ayasoma, for example? Ayasoma is in fact a fully ordained bhikkhuni, has been for many years now. I was there at her ordination. It was quite delightful. And Julie says, is there a difference between female monks in Sri Lanka, North America, and Thailand? Well, I mean, it depends on what exactly you mean by female monk. So if by female monk you specifically mean bhikkhuni, then the differences are mostly how they are viewed and treated by the culture that they're in. So there is, of course, still a certain amount of discrimination in Sri Lanka and Thailand, a certain amount of discrimination also enforced by the government to some degree. So that's quite sad, but the reality of things. In Western countries, there's not official discrimination from the government because the government actually doesn't care at all, which is a big perk. But there can still be discrimination from individuals. So that's, again, just the tragic reality of things. The Buddha himself was not sexist as far as I can tell, but that hasn't stopped plenty of Buddhists from being sexist in the past 2,500 years. On the other hand, if by female monks you just mean any woman who is practicing in some kind of monastic form, then in addition to bhikkhunis, there are several other kinds of ordinations, so fake ordinations, so not vinaya ordinations, not real ones, but fake ordinations, which have been created precisely because of the discrimination against bhikkhunis. So for example, in Thailand, it was made illegal to become a bhikkhuni in 1924. So once it was illegal to be a bhikkhuni, then they created an alternate form. So 8 precept, white-robed, pseudo-monastic, which they call Mei-chi. So that was the main form in Thailand, just because it was literally illegal to be a fully ordained woman. In Burma, similar case, they invented either 8 or 10 precept form called Thilashin or Sayale. And again, it's because it still is actually illegal for women to be fully ordained in Burma. In Sri Lanka, they invented the form called Dasasila Mata, which is a 10 precept monastic. That's the form which is the most similar to bhikkhuni, but still is clearly known as not being a real ordination. It's clearly, everybody knows that it's a fake ordination that was invented in recent decades. And yeah, it is different. For people who are not actually following a vinaya ordination, it is a lot more challenging. It's a lot more problematic in many ways. But yeah, it is revival of the Theravada Bhikkhuni order has been progressing quite well, and it's become increasingly widespread and widely recognized. I'm not sure if I fully answered your question there. Okay, and Parinaz says, I have a question about working with the hindrance of laziness / sloth and torpor in the form of losing heart. It's been extremely difficult for me to be with and yet not grasp it. I don't really understand the question. So losing heart to me sounds more like doubt rather than laziness. Unless by losing heart, you just mean losing enthusiasm. When you say it's difficult to be and yet not grasp, I don't understand what you mean. Yeah, maybe Paranaz, if you could clarify, because I'm really not understanding the question. And Rob says, it seems like there is growing interest in America to support Buddhist monastic communities. That's news to me. I mean, good news, but that's definitely news to me. And yet, relatively few monasteries. That I definitely knew. What do you think are the biggest reasons there are not more monasteries? Honestly, the biggest reason there's not more monasteries is because people are scared of renunciation. People are scared of practicing renunciation. That's the number one reason. It's easy to be a monk. You don't need monasteries. Like if you're living in accordance with the early Buddhist texts, then you don't need monasteries. You don't need institutions. You just need a robe, a bowl, and a teacher. That's it. And the teacher you only need for the first few years. What you need is the attitude of renunciation, the willingness to practice renunciation. That is the number one requirement to live a monastic life, is the attitude of renunciation. If you have that, then you can be a great monk. So honestly, I think the reason there's not many monasteries in the West is just because there's not many people who are actually really sincerely interested in being monks. I've met a lot of people who say they want to be monks, but most of them don't. Because monastic life is not glamorous. It's not comfortable. It's actually quite uncomfortable and unglamorous, in fact. But if you can be content with having only the absolute bare minimum, and sometimes not even that, if you're willing to let go of absolutely everything, including personal comfort, absolutely everything that stands between you and awakening, then monastic life is very natural and it's very straightforward. But if one does not have that genuine interest and willingness and renunciation, then one will not become a monk. Or if one does, one won't last. So I think that's the main reason. It's not about how much support there is or is not. It's about whether or not someone is actually interested in renunciation practice. And Tannik says, I tried to give Buddhist advice to others to let go and stop grasping their anger, but it just comes off as cold and indifferent, as unsympathetic. Maybe you should stop trying to give Buddhist advice to others, particularly when it sounds like it's not wanted. So giving advice to others is something which has to be done very carefully and skillfully. And most of the time, it's better not to. Yeah, I mean, if somebody is really angry and you're like, you should let go and stop grasping your anger, they're just going to get even more angry. That's not the right approach. So of course it comes across as cold and indifferent and unsympathetic. That's not the right approach. 99% of the time, that's not the right approach. Usually the right approach is actually to start with compassion, kindness, patience. Listen to them, ask them, why are you angry? What's going on? Listen to what they have to say. Pay attention to their experience. Show that you actually genuinely care. And sometimes as you do that, then that person will start letting go of their anger all by themselves. And then at some point in the future, you might find an opportunity to talk to them about the benefits of loving kindness the happiness and joy that comes through cultivating love and kindness. And eventually the person will be less angry. That's usually much better, much more effective. And Tannik says, is it against the 5 precepts to have sexual fantasy? So, first off, there's a distinction between having sexual fantasy in the sense of a mental object appearing in the mind, and then there is deliberately creating sexual fantasy, where one is actively building up desire in the mind. So first off, those are 2 different things. However, neither one of them has anything to do with the 5 precepts. So no, it's not breaking the 5 precepts. So first off, just a mental object appearing in the mind, that's nothing. That's not even the generation of karma. That's actually a manifestation of past karma. If one is actually actively engaging in and participating in and strengthening that mental object, then one is creating karma. And in this case, it's the karma that leads to stronger desires and therefore more suffering. But that's still not in the domain of breaking any precepts. That's not even breaking any of the monastic precepts. So it's something which is not recommended because it increases your dukkha, and therefore makes enlightenment a little bit harder to attain. But it's not breaking any of the precepts, not even the monastic precepts. It's when you actually do something based upon that fantasy, based on that desire, that's when you might be getting into precept breaking territory. Even then, with lay people, it's much more specific. As I mentioned earlier, the precept about sexual misconduct, it's about infidelity and assault. So if based on your fantasy and desire, you cheat on your partner or sexually assault someone, then yeah, that's breaking a precept. If you don't, then it's not breaking a precept. And Jefferson says, it is possible to enter jhana in walking meditation. Most teachers will say no. So it doesn't specifically say as much anywhere in the suttas, but in the suttas, normally when the Buddha is talking about samadhi practice, he's talking about sitting down. I don't think there's anywhere in the suttas where he actually directly mentions jhana during walking meditation. So there are some teachers who say it's theoretically possible, but I've never actually heard of it happening. So I'm actually quite skeptical that it's even theoretically possible. So Rick says, what drives binge eating and how do we stop this pattern? For weeks, I can eat in ways that are skillful and supportive of practice. Then a day comes where I overindulge and the pattern continues. Not really the best person to ask because I don't binge eat. I don't really have that kind of desire in my mind. So I don't really have a lot of experience with these sorts of things. But I would say if you can, in fact, for weeks, eat in ways that are skillful and supportive, that's great. That's good. Praise yourself for that. And if you only overindulge once every few weeks, wow, that's pretty good. Congratulate yourself that it's only once every few weeks. In fact, you might even make it deliberate. Like the first day of every month is my overeating day. Like the other 29 days of the month, I practice restraint, but one day of the month, I get to just go all out and make myself sick. Sure, why not? And just watch what it feels like. The main way to overcome bad habits like that is to pay attention to the drawbacks, pay attention to the discomfort. So you want to overindulge? Okay, overindulge and pay attention to what it feels like. What does it feel like before, during, and after? And you'll realize it feels gross. Before, during, and after, it feels gross. It's just that during, there's also a little bit of pleasure mixed in. But beforehand, predominantly gross. After, predominantly gross. During, also predominantly gross, but with some pleasure sprinkled on top. So feces in the beginning, feces in the middle, feces in the end. But in the middle, you also sprinkle a little sugar on top. And when you actually pay attention to the discomfort of the process, then the mind naturally disengages, naturally starts to lose interest. Suzanne says, sometimes in samadhi, the mind goes from tranquil to slightly drowsy. Any suggestions? Sit up straight, open your eyes, sharpen attention on the meditation object. That all helps. Sometimes actually just patience is also enough. Just wait. Just wait a little bit. Sometimes drowsiness is just a temporary current in the mind, and it just goes away on its own after a few minutes or a few seconds even. This is one of the perks of doing really long periods of sitting meditation, by the way, is you start to see the patterns in the mind. The mind is like alert, and then it's drowsy, and then it's alert, and then it's drowsy, and then it's alert, and then it's drowsy. And you're like, oh. So when the mind is in a drowsy mode, you just need to be patient for a little bit, and the mind will lift up out of it again. So those are a few options. So Parina says, as a way of working with this hindrance, this is the question about sloth and laziness earlier. In working with this hindrance, I have been suggested not to escape, solve, or fix it, and just be with it open-heartedly, but it's not helping me to change the field of my awareness. Well, if whatever you're doing is not working, then do something different. So if the just be with it approach isn't working, then stop using that approach. Do something that will brighten the mind, energize the mind, bring alertness and clarity to the mind. Often when dealing with a sense of laziness or sloth during meditation, often the best thing to do is to switch your meditation object. Often that sense of sloth and torpor is caused by a lack of interest in the meditation object you're using. So switching to a different object will tend to make the mind interested again, and therefore more willing to be present, more willing to be alert. Okay, and Rick says, when you are told that a family member is having an affair, is not telling their spouse an act of compassion or a lie of omission? Does not saying anything break the precepts, or does saying something count as divisive speech? Okay, so that's quite a nuanced situation. So first off, not saying anything is not lying. It's just not saying anything. There's lots of things I don't say. That doesn't mean I'm lying. It just means I don't see any benefit in saying those things. So the Buddha gave a number of guidelines for speech, and one of the very first ones is to ask, is it beneficial? Is it actually going to help the people involved if I say something? Is it actually going to bring benefit? If it's not going to be beneficial, don't say it. Then is it true? If it's not true, don't say it. Then consider, if you decide it is both beneficial and true, well, then you need to consider when is the right time and place. For example, you don't go to the family reunion and get up on the PA system and announce, Bob is cheating on his wife, like to the whole room. That would be wrong time and place, probably. Maybe sometimes that would be right. But usually that's probably not the right time and place. Then the Buddha says you should speak, when you do speak, you should speak gently, not harshly. And finally, you should only speak when your mind is full of loving kindness, not when you have any kind of inner aversion or hostility. So your mind has to be very pure and full of kindness when you speak. So all of that together will help make sure that, well, one, you probably don't say anything most of the time. But when you do, it will be, in fact, correct. It will be appropriate. So most of the time you wind up just not saying anything. Like, it's for them to sort out their own twisted karma. Usually you just have to just step back and be like, okay, they're choosing to mess up their lives. That's sad, but not much I can do about it. But every once in a while, you'll see an opening and you're like, okay, there's an opportunity here to be helpful. And you can take that opportunity to be helpful. But you need to be really careful that you're following the Buddha's guidelines on when to bring up things like this. And Tannik asks, is it against the 5 precepts to be angry? No, it isn't. It is not. Anger itself is a mind state. The precepts are all about physical actions, not about mind states. That said, if based upon that anger, you kill, steal, perform sexual misconduct, tell lies, or use intoxicants, then you're breaking the precepts. So just having a mind state of anger is not breaking a precept. Now, nurturing anger is, of course, violating principles of Dhamma, but it's not breaking any precepts. Okay, so Michael Tapp says, you are stranded on a deserted island after a plane crash. That's never happened to me, but okay. You and another survivor are the only ones alive. Before he dies, the other survivor asks you to donate his $1 million to the Yankees, a team he loved deeply, and you agree. I just wouldn't agree. I mean, this thought experiment is already falling apart because there's just no possible way I would agree to do something so ridiculous. Back in New York, a trusted charity urgently needs $1 million to save thousands of lives. I would have already told the person I was going to give their money to charity. I would never, ever say I'm going to give even $1 to a bloody sports team. Like, this thought experiment just doesn't function at all. So the person's dying and they're like, please give my money to the Yankees. I'd be like, not going to happen. No, I'm going to donate it to a charity. I would have told them that from day one. So that solves that problem. I actually find a lot of these moral dilemmas, when you view them through the lens of Buddha Dhamma, they're just not dilemmas. The answer is really clear. So Tannik says, if I keep the 5 precepts, but all these negative emotions like greed and aversion still arise in me all the time, and sometimes I have evil intention, but I try not to act on them, will I still go to hell? You might, yeah. It's quite possible. But the fact that you're trying not to act on them is good, and that will build up good karma. Yep. But yeah, try to reduce that greed and aversion in your mind, because that's a big problem. But the fact that you're not acting on it is actually really important, because not acting on it is already a huge step towards weakening it. So when you recognize the desire and aversion, but you say, no, I'm not going to do a physical action based on this desire and aversion, then you're already getting a bit of control over your mind. So that's good. That's part of why the precepts are important, is because they help us to understand and control our mind. It's not just about controlling the body. It actually forms the preconditions for controlling the mind. Rick asks, can you share how to focus on the space element in meditation and daily life practice? To be honest, I mostly don't recommend focusing on the space element, because most people, they're just not there. Like, most people, they have a hard enough time just being aware of their body. Most people, what they really need to do is just do mindfulness of the body 99.9% of the time, and read suttas. Mindfulness of the body and read suttas. That's what they should be doing. Meditation on the space element, it has its use, but for most people, it's not going to be very useful. And where it does have use is as part of the 6 elements, the first 4 of which are all about mindfulness of the body. So when you have that solid foundation in mindfulness of the body based on the first 4 elements, then adding in the space element is a natural evolution to mindfulness of the body. So that's where it's relevant. But for most people, like, if you try to go directly to the space element, you're actually going to be doing the spacing out element, which is not Buddhism. It's just wasting time. Yeah, most of the time when people talk to me about their space element practice, they're actually talking about their wasting time practice. So I really don't recommend it, again, except as a natural evolution from the first 4 elements. And in that context, once you have a solid, clear, stable awareness of your physical body through the first 4 elements, then you recognize the empty space occupied by the body. But that's only possible if you already have strong mindfulness of the body. Then recognizing the space occupied by the body, That is awareness of the space element, mindfulness of the space element. And the point of doing so is to recognize that, just as with all the other elements, it's not me and not mine. So the space occupied by the body is not me, it's not mine, it's just part of nature. Just as the elements of the body. So the solid matter, liquid matter, heat, and air of the body are also not me and not mine, just part of nature. In the same way, the space occupied by the body is not me, not mine, just part of nature. So that's its use. Its function is as a vipassana practice, as a way of recognizing the impersonal or non-self nature of the body. But again, it is founded upon mindfulness of the body. You don't go directly to the space element. Amy says, can you provide any advice on how to respond to people who don't understand one's practice, which may cause them to misinterpret one's actions? For example, when I work on not getting upset about things I used to get upset about, they think I just don't care anymore. Well, sometimes you just need to explain to people. Just explain what you're doing and why you're doing it and how it makes you happier and calmer than you used to be, and that you actually really like being happy and calm. And sometimes they'll understand and sometimes they won't. And that's okay. It's not realistic to expect everyone to understand you. It's actually quite normal that most people will not understand you. So at some point we need to come to terms with the fact that most people will not understand us, and that's perfectly fine. That's just how life works. Julie says, what is the point or use of the space element? I think I answered that sufficiently just now. And Julie says, I have felt energy or something on my body when nothing was there. Is this related to the space element? No, that's not space element. No, space element is literally the sense of empty space, which the body occupies. That's what it is. So it's the space which the body moves through, which the body fills. That's the space element. And Suzanne asks, do you recommend doing emptiness practice? Depends on who I'm talking to. Most people know. Most people trying to do emptiness practice winds up just being a waste of time. If you don't already have very strong mindfulness of the body and very strong concentration and a good basis in recognizing impermanence and non-self, if you try to do emptiness meditation without those prerequisites in place, you're probably just going to wind up wasting time and not actually doing anything useful. So emptiness meditation is great. It's very powerful. It's very effective. It's very interesting. However, you need to have those prerequisites in place, or else it's not going to do you any good. That's the last question online. We still have a few minutes if there's any questions from the residents here.
Emptiness of the mindfulness of the body. Can you describe that sensation, or is it
Can you feel your body?
The sensation of that, the mindfulness of the body. I know we talk about the different qualities of the body or the elements which go through, but that's probably it.
Yeah, just feeling your body. Be aware of what your body feels like. Pay attention to the actual immediate sensation of the body. So it's not a concept, it's not an idea, it's not an image, it's not a memory, it's not an abstraction. It's this actual felt experience right now. This is mindfulness of the body. It's feeling this hard, wet, hot, meaty thing right now. That's mindfulness of the body. Like, what does it feel like right now? Like right now, do you feel this heavy, hot, wet thing right here? Well, right there for you. Do you feel it? This is your body, this like heavy, hot thing right here. Do you feel it? Yes or no? Do you feel it? Okay, good. You're doing mindfulness of the body.
Is there a place, specific place in the body that you recommend put your attention on?
Ideally is actually to feel the whole body all at once. That's ideal. It's okay to center on a certain point if that helps you. I commonly recommend either the feeling of your hands in your lap or a place in your abdomen. The exact size doesn't matter. Usually anywhere from like the size of a pinpoint up to the size of like a baseball or something. Like anywhere in there is fine. The exact size doesn't really matter, but just somewhere in your abdomen. Or the feeling of your legs against the cushion. Feeling of your legs on the ground. That also can be really helpful. But really anywhere in the body is fine as long as it gives a solid anchor for your attention. Hands in the lap tends to be really effective for a lot of people. Yeah, anywhere in the body is fine. Okay, there's a couple more questions online. Oh, you had a question?
Yeah, can you remind us the instruction of samadhi practice?
That's a big question. Let's talk about it tomorrow. Yeah. Briefly speaking, pay attention, hold still. Okay? Yeah. That's the 4-word answer. Okay, so Rick says, during over 40 years of Zen practice, I have developed strengths in mindfulness of the body and the ability to visualize. That has nothing to do with Zen. Zen doesn't have any visualization practices at all. So I don't know where that came from. He says, I notice a growing sensitivity to space, inside and outside. Can you talk about how the space around us impacts practice? Being in an open space like an A-frame house or temple is a great support of meditation, faith, and metta. Okay, that's not my experience, but okay. For me, like wherever I go, it's the same mind. Like whether I'm sitting in a space with an A-frame roof or a flat roof, it's the same mind. Whether I'm sitting outside or inside, it's the same mind. Whether I'm sitting in the forest or on the beach, it's the same mind. Like my mind is pretty much the same anywhere I go. So I haven't actually noticed a real difference. But I know some people, they notice a really big difference. But it's not my experience. I notice a slight difference sometimes, but not dramatically so. Generally speaking, a quiet, peaceful place is best. Whether it's big or small or inside or outside or what kind of roof it has, that doesn't really seem to matter. I'm much more concerned about you saying you develop the ability to visualize because that's not anything to do with either Zen or Theravada practice. And Dharma Learner says, can you define emptiness meditation? Well, the simple explanation of emptiness meditation. Do you feel my pain? Trying to cram a 3-hour talk into 10 seconds. Emptiness meditation, briefly speaking, recognize that nothing can be described as either existent or non-existent. That's the brief answer. Got it? Good. This is why I said you can't start there. Like, emptiness meditation is very advanced and very difficult. The most well-known form of it is actually what's taught in the Chan schools, called silent illumination or shikantaza, or just sitting. That's the most well-known and direct form. In the Theravada tradition, it's called animitta samadhi, objectless concentration. It's the most direct way of directly perceiving emptiness. But it's really difficult. It's really subtle. And as I mentioned before, if you don't already have a very solid foundation in other kinds of meditation, especially mindfulness of the body and the recognition of impermanence, then you're not going to get anywhere with emptiness meditation. You're just going to wind up wasting a lot of time and probably spacing out. Okay, and that's the last question. Yeah, go ahead.
So earlier you said that like the 5 precepts is based off of action.
Mhm.
I feel like I remember Monk saying once that like if you're mentally thinking like, oh, I'm gonna steal this cup, but you don't steal it, that's like bad karma.
It is bad karma, but it's not breaking the precept. The precept is when you actually steal the object. Thinking, I'm going to steal that object, that's creating bad karma because you're forming unwholesome intentions. And unwholesome intentions are the prerequisite for unwholesome actions. So it is still bad karma. But the precept is the actual action. So the 5 precepts are really, really basic, minimal standards. You can still be a really, really terrible person and follow the 5 precepts.
And for the precept of restraining from lying, does restraining from gossip, malicious speech, and harsh speech?
Those actually aren't included in the 5 precepts. Those are in the Noble Eightfold Path in the section under right speech. So the 5 precepts is, once again, it's absolute bare minimum of somewhat tolerable human being. Like 5 precepts is it's just like the most basic baseline. Like don't lie, don't tell lies. Like that's the absolute baseline. In the Eightfold Path on right speech, the Buddha goes into more description. He's like, don't tell lies, instead, tell the truth. Honor the truth, protect the truth. Don't engage in divisive speech, in malicious gossip. Instead, seek to promote harmony and concord. Seek to unite people. Seek to create good connections between people rather than driving them apart. Don't engage in harsh speech. Instead, engage in gentle, kind, and loving speech. And finally, don't engage in useless speech, but instead speak words which are useful and beneficial and based on the Dhamma. So the absolute baseline, the 5 precepts, again, are the absolute baseline of somewhat decent behavior. And then the Eightfold Path is building on that. And building on that is the more refined development of right speech. Okay. And that looks like it for this evening. So I think we'll go ahead and conclude at this time with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.